The green growth and the role of state, in order to have these innovations to emerge, to take off, you need some incentives, some signals. Mm-hmm. For instance, if you don't have a way of valuing environmental goods and the carbon footprint in the economy, it's going to be very difficult to generate incentives at the individual level mm-hmm. to make these innovations. So you need environmental policies, you need some way of putting the value of these environmental goods in the prices of goods and services. But that's not enough. So in the first sort of price signal, of course, this is the role for the government, of course. Carbon taxes or tradable permits, other forms of standards, this is typically the role for the public sector. But that's not enough. It's not going. It's not because you are going to put a carbon tax in the economy that necessarily the innovation is going to be directed towards the green parts of the economy. Because why? Because you can have very strong productivity in the less environmental friendly parts of the economy. And if you have a much higher rate of productivity in this more, let's call it brown economy, opposed to green economy, the enterprises will have strong incentives to invest there and to go there. So in some sense you have to complement the environmental policies by other types of policies. And other types of policies could be, typically things directed towards R&D. For instance, now we are in the middle of a crisis, and we know that all these innovation activities are extremely, what we call in the economist jargon, pro-cyclical. It means by that when you have a crisis, you don't have a lot of patenting, trademarks, R&D. When you are in the booming phases of the economic cycle, the patents, these innovation activities take off. But it's a bit it's a pity that we don't take advantage that precisely we are in a recession. The relative prices of doing innovation, of doing R&D actually are lower. When you are in a period of boom, everybody is fighting to attract engineers, scientists, etc. Mm-hmm. When you are in a sort of phases of recession, actually the price of this investment is lower. So there, we could have some sort of action by the public sector to generate the right incentives to make these innovation activities a bit less pro-cyclical. Actually, if they are counter-cyclical, it will be nice because they create the potential to take the economy out of the crisis. So in these two areas, and I think the role of the public sector, of the governments, is essential. But it's really in the sense of providing the right signals and the right environment. Mm-hmm. Not on the sort of a traditional way of subsidizing certain parts of the economy or certain firms or certain sectors. Mm-hmm. It's more in sort of providing this environment and be very careful to this networked element of the innovation, mm-hmm. this interaction part of the innovation process.
There are averages across OECD countries, and so when you're farther above, really far above or really below, you might ask why and why is it a problem? So oftentimes you have in lesser developed countries, for example in Latin America, where the public component is very, very high relative to the private. That it's a phase of development. As you get more advanced, obviously the goal is to leverage as much private investment as possible in terms of R&D investment. When you look at particular regions, you also just have to take into account the distribution of research assets and of industrial structure, because you can have some regions where they just have a lot of research assets. If you take a region that doesn't have research centers, doesn't have universities, well, obviously they could have a lower share of public R&D. Is that good? Not necessarily, because they might not have the kind of R&D that generates knowledge, the sort of basic research that is best done by public actors, because private actors can't necessarily appropriate all of the economic benefits of that research. So there is a strong role for the public sector. It should be, in theory, oriented more towards this basic side, and then different programs as you progress closer to sort of commercial applications. But you shouldn't just take a ratio at face value. You really have to understand what's driving it and at what spatial scale you're looking at. the idea of agglomeration economies has existed for many, many years. An economist by the name of Marshall had talked about this in England. What has become popular, especially through Michael Porter, who's actually had an influence on Catalan policy back in the 1990s, he brought the word cluster really to the forefront, and you saw a very clear policy trend on giving a name to the groups of firms that interact and that benefit from sharing a labor market, that benefit from linkages across each other. Over time, those definitions, and there's not one agreed definition of what is a cluster, and if you go to any of these cluster conferences, you'll see that there are debates by different academics and practitioners. What's important to think about is that as we've progressed in our understanding of the innovation process and what's important, we realize that it's not only interactions among firms and the service providers that work for those firms, like IP lawyers who work in the biotech that support the biotech sector, for example, but you need an interaction between firms, universities, research centers, intermediaries that help bridge the gap. And so in some cases that's called more of an innovation system, but obviously these can be aligned more by the sector that a particular cluster is more associated with. Now, in terms of the risks, there are risks in the kinds of cluster policies that are promoted by public entities, that it reinforces a particular sector, that it can help develop lobbies that maybe try to seek to protect a sector that really needs to evolve because of global trends. And what we would just say is that a good cluster policy should try to ensure that it doesn't only pick winners, but it leaves opportunities for others to gain in prominence, so that you don't protect industries unnecessarily, that it recognizes that the innovation process is multidisciplinary and requires knowledge and different types of firms, and that therefore if your approach is too sectoral, you're going to miss out on what is really the trend in the innovation process, which is this multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary approach, and it can combine science and social sciences. It can combine a very wide range. I'll give you an example. A cluster in Sweden, early childhood development. Now that's not something that you would think about traditionally as a cluster, but they put together toy manufacturers, people in the healthcare sector who work with children, etc., because they see the cluster in a sort of more comprehensive way, and I think that's really the trend for the future for cluster approaches. But we have to remember that there are different stages of development. You can be very sophisticated, but in some cases you also just need to reach out to the SMEs in local production systems, and in some cases it's a bit more of the traditional approach, and there's still some value in providing these kinds of networking services that bring firms together, often that are co-located in geographic proximity. However, you could have clusters that could involve networks that are outside of the region. It's not always geographic, but in many cases it is.
From the Lisbon agenda was a great idea. If we get a bit step back, why the Lisbon agenda emerged is because there was this sense that there was a gap in terms of this productivity, aggregate productivity of the economy between the US and Europe, and policymakers in Europe find that was not sustainable. And of course, this gap of productivity in sort of broad terms was like with the US growing at around 3% per year growth of productivity, and Europe growing more at 1-2% per year. So this gap, if you compound this gap over time, it generates a huge sort of gap in terms of levels, and that was seen as not being sustainable. And of course, this gap could be exacerbated because of the aging problems, because as I said, in the US the labor force is going to continue to increase over time. Over the next, it's projected to continue to increase to the next 50 years, in part due to the migration flows. And in Europe, labor force is now reaching a sort of plateau and will tend to decline. So the Lisbon agenda was a way of sort of spurring this sort of productivity in Europe in order to address this gap. The problem, if I can say so, quote unquote, with the Lisbon agenda